In this video, we're going to be discussing the great sage Rav, as he is known in the Talmud, probably the most quoted rabbi in the Talmud. Um, he was born approximately the year 175 and passed away in the year 247. His real name was not Rav. Rav means a rabbi or a teacher. His name was Abba, which literally translates to as father. It was a very popular name in that time period. As we go through other rabbis of the Talmud, we'll meet some other Abbas. He was called Abba Richta or Abba Richa, which means the tall Abba, because he was apparently a very tall person. That says that his student Rabbi Yehuda only came up to his shoulder. So apparently that was meant to be literal, not metaphorical, but at any rate. He was known as Rav, as the great rabbi, because he was the greatest rabbi and the teacher of all in Babylon, as we shall soon see. He came from a very miyuchas family, a very treasured genealogy. He was a descendant of the brother of King David, one of King David's brothers, Shimma. He also his uncle was Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia was one of the great sages of that generation, and the way he was Rabbi Chia's uncle it was his mother's brother and his father's brother. Okay, how does that happen? So apparently, Rabbi Chia, so it was Rabbi Chia's brother, Rav's father, whose name was Evu. Evu, his brother, was Rabbi Chia from his father, and from his mother, it was his mother's brother from her mother. So, in other words, they were not brothers and sisters. They were not related at all. It just happens to be they shared a brother, if that makes sense. So, in other words, his father's Evu, his parents were not his wife's parents, different people. But one of his parents married, I guess, in a second marriage, one of his wife's parents and had a child named Chia. I guess that's kind of how it worked out. At any rate, so it was his uncle from both sides, and Rabbi Chia took this young man from Babylon, and Rabbi Chia went to the land of Israel, where they went, and Rabbi Chia was already a great sage, and he kind of brought his nephew into the fold of the Beis Medrash, of the study hall of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, also known as Rebbe. And there are many stories in the Talmud with Rav interacting with Rebbe, and you could see how he was being, let into that fold. Eventually, Rav becomes part of the inner circle, to the point where it was described by some of his colleagues that they would be sitting all the way in the back, and Rav would be sitting all the way in the front, which means that you're more part of the inner circle. They literally would put benches in the study hall based on how you were seated based on your intellectual prowess, I guess is the best way to say it. So he was sitting all the way in the front, and it says that Rebbe and Rav would be spitting fire, and but nobody understood. It was beyond over everyone else's heads. So obviously Rav was a tremendous a student, even at a young age. Eventually he was admitted into the Beis Din, the court of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. However, he was not given smicha. Smicha, for context, smicha, which literally means like rabbinic ordination. Today's rabbinic ordination is essentially you study certain materials, you get tested, you're considered proficient, and then you're given the title rabbi. Real smicha, which stopped around a little bit after that time, meant that you received. Literally, smicha means to lean, and they would lean lean on the next generation. They would literally, actually, it was a process of literal leaning, where they would put their hands on the head of the next generation, of the next rabbi, and they would say, "Okay, you are now good enough to be proficient in all these laws. Okay, all the laws of the Torah." That's what real smicha meant. And this smicha goes back all the way to Moses. Moses gave smicha to Yehoshua, to Joshua, and every single generation had that. It was a real smicha. It means that you were fully proficient in the entire Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi realized that Rav was going to go back to Babylon at some point, and because of that, he did not want to he did not want to give smicha to someone who would be living in Babylon, because he did not want to weaken the small amount of Jews who were still living in Israel at the time. So he said, if I'm going to give smicha to people who are going to Babylon, then people will just keep going to Babylon. He wanted to kind of strengthen whatever was left of Jews living in the land of Israel. So he only gave Rav a partial smicha, which means he gave him like proficient in certain areas, and he didn't want to give him proficiency in other areas. And in fact, Rabbi Gamliel, who was the son of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, after Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's passing, did not even want to give the remaining smicha to Rav, because he said, "My father wouldn't give it to you. Who am I to overrule that?" So in that way, Rav did not have full smicha from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but he did have partial smicha, I guess is the best way to say it. He left, eventually he did leave Israel, and he went to Babylon to get married. Before he goes back to Babylon to get married, Rabbi Chia, his uncle, gives him a blessing that you should not find something worse than death. And he didn't understand, what do you mean? What could be worse than death? And later he realized that Rabbi Chia was referring to a bad wife. A bad wife is something worse than death. And Rav had a tremendously bad wife, a miserable wife, apparently. The Talmud tells us a story that his wife would constantly do everything wrong. If he told her to make peas, she would make lentils, and everything he asked her, she did the opposite. And one time, his son, whose name was Chia, named after his uncle, he gave him. He said, "Listen, my father asked me to tell my mother to make him something. She's going to make the opposite. So let me just say the opposite, and he'll make the right thing." So what happened was, now his wife is starting to make the right things for him, and he thinks, "Wow, my marriage is on the up and up." So he tells his son, "Wow, this is amazing. Looks like we're on better terms now. My wife isn't so vindictive." And he had to tell him, "Listen, it's not like that. I've been playing games, saying the opposite." And he said, "Don't lie. Don't ever lie to your mother like that." Now, funny enough, even though Rav apparently had a miserable wife, he still made many takanas, many decrees related to marriage, specifically that encourage marital harmony and respect for one's wife. So it was a very interesting dynamic. Eventually, he goes back to the land of Israel, and he's there until after the passing of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi passed away, he goes back to Israel. Back to Babylon, this time for good. And he goes to the city of Neharda. And this is the year 219, approximately. He's now in Neharda. This is the great yeshiva of Babylon is there. And he quickly makes a name for himself in the yeshiva, and the head of the yeshiva at that time was Rabbi Shela. After Rabbi Shela's passing, not long after he got there, a few years after he got there, there was a debate who should take over the yeshiva. Should it be him or the great sage of Babylon at the time, Shmuel? And Rav did not want to seemingly take away the job from Shmuel. Apparently, we'll talk about Shmuel in a coming video, so we'll leave that for why Shmuel was considered more appropriate for that yeshiva. And Rav goes to his hometown, Kafri, which was a different part of Babylon, and he opens up a yeshiva nearby his hometown in the city called Sura. And Sura's yeshiva lasts for hundreds and hundreds of years, probably close to 800 to 1,000 years. Hit that yeshiva kept going. Many of the Gaonim that we've discussed in previous videos, they were the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the academy of that yeshiva of Sura. And Sura quickly becomes a very popular destination. And overnight, he literally takes over an abandoned house, essentially. I believe it was a house of a convert to Judaism who had no heirs, and he left his house to the community. Rav takes over this house, and he builds this tremendous institution of Torah, and eventually being known as Rav, the teacher of all, essentially. He also studied Kabbalah. We know that Rav studied what we would call Kabbalah, the inner dimension of the Torah. He became so proficient, like we said, even though he didn't have full smicha. The Talmud relates that the law follows Rav in all matters of Isser, which means anything of a prohibition from the Torah. any debate regarding that, the law follows Rav, versus any financial law, the law follows Shmuel, his counterpart and colleague in Naharda. He is also mentioned in Brisus, which means Mishnahs essentially that didn't make it into the canon of the Mishnah. So let's take a step back. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is considered towards the end of the Tanoim, which are the rabbis of the Mishnah. The rabbis of the Mishnah goes over hundreds and hundred years. All Rabbi Yehuda Nasi collected everything, all those sayings, and he put them into the Mishnah. So once you had that kind of an end of a era, it became kind of canonized that no longer could we argue with the previous generations. So the rabbis of the Talmud, which are called Amoraim, are not supposed to argue with Tanoim. So let's say a rabbi, for example, in the Talmud, were to make a statement that would seem inconsistent with the Tanoim, with the previous generations, the rabbis of the Mishnah. So the Talmud now has to figure out, are they actually arguing, which we would not accept that, or are they actually saying something, a specific case that is different than the case discussed by the rabbis in the Mishnah, or are they following a different opinion than the one that is in the Mishnah? And they could find a brisa, which means, again, like we said, a Mishnah that is not in the canon. Is there another version where the rabbis had a debate that is not recorded in the Mishnah? We have to find, basically fit this square peg into that round hole somehow, some way, because again, the rabbis of the Talmud cannot argue with the rabbis of the Mishnah. They're not considered on their level. Like we mentioned, most rabbis of the Mishnah had smicha. I think all of them did. Versus rabbis of the Talmud, most of them did not. We'll discuss that probably at a different date. So what happened is Rav is mentioned in some brisos, which means he's kind of has this kind of. Is he the first of the rabbis of the Talmud, which generally that's how we see him, first of the rabbis of the Talmud, or is he the last of the rabbis of the Mishnah? And sometimes the Talmud will go through an entire process of trying to figure out how does Rav's opinion fit with the Mishnah. And sometimes the Talmud will come to the conclusion that Rav Tana Upalik, which means Rav is also a Tana, he is also a rabbi of the Mishnah, and therefore he can argue with the rabbis of the Mishnah. So we see how much the Talmud held Rav in esteem, that he was actually that kind of bridge, rabbi, that he was, in a way, he was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he studied by other rabbis who are quoted in the Mishnah. He himself was quoted in some brises, though not in the Mishnah, and he's also the most quoted probably rabbi in the Talmud, and so he has this bridge gap, and sometimes we consider him a Tana, a rabbi of the Mishnah, to the point that he could even argue with the rabbis of the Mishnah. He also had he had children. He had two sons. He had a son, we mentioned Rabbi Chia, who also became a great rabbi in the Talmud. And then he had another son whose name was Evu, named after his father, who he realized very quickly that he was not a scholarly type, and he put him into business. So it's very interesting that Rav, even though he was obviously a great rabbi and he wanted his children to follow in his steps, when he saw that his son didn't have the skills necessary, he arranged for him to become a businessman. He also had two daughters, and some of his grandchildren from his daughters also became rabbis who are mentioned in the Talmud. When Rav passed away, Shmuel, his colleague in Naharda, tore 13 garments as in mourning for the passing of Rav. One of his students also decreed that nobody should have too much joy throughout the entire year. So it was a tremendous loss for the entire Babylonian Torah community. Let's go through a little bit of some of his statements. There's, like we said, the most quoted rabbi probably in the Talmud. And one of his, just a couple of his sayings, one of his sayings was that the entire world was worth it to create the entire world for King David. That King David's righteousness was worth creation. Another one was, one should not remove himself from the base medrash even for 1 hour. So, meaning from the study hall for even 1 hour. And this was something obviously that Rav himself lived by, and that's how he became such a great sage, was his dedication to Torah study. There's also decrees that we mentioned. One of them is that one should not marry a woman without seeing her. One should treat his wife correctly. So there's lots of different decrees that he made. He also was involved in writing prayers. For example, there's the prayers that we say in Rosh Hashanah in the three blessings in the Musaf Rosh Hashanah. Those prayers are written by Rav. Including in that is the Aleinu prayer. The Aleinu prayer is part of Rosh Hashanah prayer services, and about 1,000 years probably after Rav lived, that prayer became popular. We'll talk about that maybe in another time, but essentially that prayer became very popular and became the end of every single prayer that we say. So that means if we're praying 3 times a day, we say it at least 3 times a day. If it's on a Shabbos, it's also 3 times, I should say. But so we say it at least 3 times a day. Sometimes we say it also part of Kirsh Levana or other things. So Aleinu is probably the most consistent prayer of in all our prayers was authored by Rav. He also was involved in authoring other prayers together with Shmuel. They authored some prayers together. There's also a prayer that some people say on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh. That prayer was actually a prayer not related to Rosh Chodesh specifically, but it's a prayer that Rav used to say every time he exited the Beis Medrash, the study hall, and that prayer is, many Siddurim have that prayer in as well. His students, some of his famous students was Rav Yehuda. We might have mentioned it before. We had Rav Chizda, Rav Gidel, Rav Huna, Rabba Bar Rabba. Sorry, Rabba Bar Rav Huna, I believe. And so there's many great rabbis who are mentioned in the Talmud as quoting Rav, and obviously were his students. So, and again, some of these rabbis are some of the most quoted rabbis because they're constantly quoting Rav. So Rav is probably one of the most influential on us today in a way, as far as rabbis of the Talmud, because of between his prayers, his decrees, his erudition that we understand much of the Talmud and many of the practical laws of the Talmud only because of Rav. And he was, and it just goes to show you the fact that they called him Rav. They didn't call him by even his name, even though that was very common. Even his colleague was called Shmuel, but he was called Rav because he was the teacher of all. So that is pretty much the basic overview of the life of Rav. And thank you very much for joining. We appreciate it. If you would like to subscribe to our channel so you can get more videos, we would appreciate that. If you can leave a comment, do you have any questions, comments, something I could have said, should have said, if I made a mistake, please put in the comments. We love comments. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next video.